All right. So today, exciting day in this course. We are shifting from microeconomics to macroeconomics. Macro from the Latin, I'm not sure, big, broader scale. I don't know. Anyone know what macro in Latin means? Or why they use the term macro?
Big,
Large.
Like a Mac truck. Like enable macros on a computer. I don't know what that means. Alright, so it just means big, broader look at the whole economy rather than individual firm actions and how that adds up to things in microeconomics. We'll be looking at broader indicators of the whole economy. And we're going to start off with a discussion about economic growth and how we measure economic growth. And growth could be positive, the economy is doing well, or it could be negative, the economy is in contraction. Oh, you can need a, gosh, here you go, Stephanie.
Yep.
All right. So, the primary way we measure economic growth, GDP, gross domestic product. We'll talk about what that is, how we measure it, how we can just use that simplified term to give us some indication of what's going on in the economy. We'll talk about some nuances with that, and then we'll talk about business cycles and how we can watch GDP increase and decrease. And then we'll talk about the byproduct of GDP increases and decreases in that it changes the unemployment rate. So high GDP means high growth and low unemployment rate. If I could talk properly, the opposite is low GDP, whatever that is. I got lost. Let's just go ahead and get back to some definitions like GDP. All right. So GDP, gross domestic product, is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a nation during a period of time. So we measure final goods. We don't measure intermediate goods. These are goods that are produced and sold to the final end user. Goods that are along the path of that production process, maybe the raw materials, they are not counted in final goods. Used cars that are sold 2, 3, 4 times, those are not included in GDP. It's only the first time this final good is sold. And also there's non-market transactions, things that we do not get paid for, or things we do not pay for, such as if you do a do-it-yourself fixer-upper on your house. That's not something that is counted on GDP. But it is a good measure nonetheless, give us a good general sense. Market value of all final goods produced in a nation during a period of time, usually a year. All right, we know what final goods means, we know what intermediate goods are, and we do not include intermediate goods in GDP. Only final goods. Final GDP is measured in dollars. We don't use the used car, we don't double count that. Transfer payment. We talked about transfer payment in the initial sections of micro. This might be Social Security, welfare, money that is transferred typically from a government to individual consumers for non-productive activities or non-productive things. These transfer payments are not counted in GDP. Other non-productive financial transactions, such as giving someone a gift, such as a company issuing stocks, bonds. If a company is issuing stocks and bonds, the value associated with that company has already been created. The investors have already invested, bought the stuff. Issuing stocks is just a secondary transaction. So those are not included in GDP. And GDP measures expenditures. So what did consumers spend? What did companies spend? What did a government spend? In dollars of final goods and services. Make sense so far? All right, so those are just some of the basics to help us understand GDP. All right, and we're going to look at 4 sectors four components of GDP: consumption by individuals, investments by companies, government expenditures, and we will add foreign exchange. We'll add consumers in foreign markets who buy our goods and subtract off imports, the consumption that is actually created by external countries. This is our GDP formula. Consumption plus our investment plus government spending plus the net imports, exports, net foreign trade. Alright, so I threw a lot of the basics at you real quick. Let's just take a breath. Make sure we feel good about that. Actually, why don't we go to the breakdown. 2013, the GDP for the United States came out to, you can't see it at the bottom of this slide, but you can see it at the bottom, I believe, of your slides. $16.86 trillion was the United States GDP in 2013. That is the total expenditures, final goods and services. The personal consumption was the largest part of that, 70%, $11.5 trillion. Durable, non-durable goods. Durable just means goods that last more than a year. Non-durable are goods that are consumed and last less than a year. Services. All right, $7.6 trillion in services. Seems like a lot, right? So we are more of a service economy. Consultants, doctors, lawyers, engineers, designing stuff. $7.6 trillion in that consumption was by personal consumption. All right, and the next part is private domestic investment. So this is private companies, as opposed to the public government, investing in factories to produce goods. That amounted to $2.7 trillion, a good 16% of our total GDP was factories creating stuff, or companies creating factories and such to build this GDP. And government expenditures, $3.1 trillion, almost 20% of our GDP was government spending. So governments will often try to spend more to spur the economy. We'll talk about that later when we talk about cycles. So government accounted for a large piece of this GDP in the United States in 2013. Now let's look at this net exports of goods and services. So the exports, this $2.3 trillion, that means goods that were produced by American companies and sold to overseas markets. So goods and services that Mexican citizens bought from American companies. The thing is, so we add that. The 2.3 is added. And then there's the imports. So those are goods that American citizens bought that were produced by foreign markets. And the thing with that 2.8 is that is already included in the personal consumption. It's already concluded in this $11 trillion. So this is already purchased by American citizens and already added in. But then when we go back to do the books, we say, well, that was made in China. So we need to subtract that off. So we add the exports and subtract the imports, and it comes out to negative $0.5 trillion. Not a huge effect on our GDP, but it's still a big number. $500 billion. Politicians like to say that we have $500 billion trade imbalance. Donald Trump likes to talk about that. We're getting screwed in international trade. We are, for whatever reason, tariffs, regulations, possibly competitive factors, we are currently at a trade imbalance. Any questions on that? Comments on that? All right. Well, let's take a look at size of economies as measured by GDP. United States is at our $16.8 trillion in 2013. China, 9.2, huge GDP. Japan, of course, strong GDP. Germany, United States, Russia. So we are, when I say we, I guess the United States is largest economy via GDP metric. So, there are some shortcomings with looking at the GDP as the indicator of economic growth and contraction. There's some things that GDP doesn't really account for, but as long as we're aware of those, it's fine. When we understand what GDP doesn't measure, then we can use it more fluently as our core measure of economic growth. Non-market transactions. So if we have someone raising a child, for example, that might be an activity that requires a lot of resources, but that is not something that is typically paid. So that is not something that is accounted for in GDP. Other non-market transactions I mentioned, like a do-it-yourself work. If you hire a construction company to build your porch, then that counts as GDP and that registers as economic activity, and that looks like we're growing the economy if everyone does that. But if you build your own porch, do it yourself, you're still doing the work, you're still improving the quality of your life. You have a porch. I mean, before you didn't have a porch. So you could say that there's been an improvement in your economic situation, but that's not covered, that's not measured in GDP. Distribution, kind, and quality of products. So GDP doesn't measure the distribution of wealth. So this $16.8 trillion, it could have been, there's a benefit from that, the profit from that could have gone to a select few. Doesn't measure that. Kind and quality of products. So just because we have a huge GDP, does that mean we have great stuff? Not necessarily. A lot of that GDP could have been military spending that most people don't benefit from. A lot of it could have been crappy products that aren't improving the quality of our life. It just measures the total. Neglect of leisure time. So the United States had a $16.8 trillion, but maybe we worked really hard for that. Maybe we, on average, are overstressed. Maybe Americans don't enjoy work-life balance. GDP doesn't measure that. Maybe if you live in France, you work a 30-hour week and you take all of August off, and you have a better quality of life, your economic situation is better, but your GDP is reflected as much, much lower. Underground economy, the black market, when things are produced and sold because the regular economy does not account for it, could be a large part of the economy, could be a small part of the economy, but it's not measured. If we think of for example, of communist Russia, various things that were produced and provided for in the black market, things that we may look at and say, well, that was just things that a normal, healthy, functioning economy would need, but it's being completely missed in GDP measures. And lastly, economic bads. We talked about pollution being having a negative quality, being what economists would call an economic bad. And that is something that is accounted for in GDP because we regulate for that. We potentially charge companies if they're polluting. So that is an economic bad, but it's not an economic bad that is not accounted for. Pollution is just an example of something that has a negative effect on the economy. There are other things that have negative effects on the economy that GDP can't account for. Minor pollution. I don't know, what else would be an example? Something help me out. Something that just is being produced, but it's not. It's creating a negative byproduct. And even though it raises our GDP,
Addiction or something.
yes,
Or
okay.
unhealthy, like cigarettes.
Yeah, okay, yes, so yes, great idea. So cigarettes are being sold, more cigarettes are sold, that raises our GDP. Economists look at that and say, well, that's great. Politicians look at that and say, that's really great. But we're creating social problems. Our quality of life may be decreasing as a result of this product.
Alcoholism.
Definitely. Same type of argument. All right. It's quantitative. It's just a number. It doesn't measure quality of life. All right. Any questions on that before we look at some nuances of other ways to look at GDP? All right. I think we've got a good firm grip of what GDP is, how we can use it. We're going to look at other measures, which are versions of GDP. National income, personal disposable income. Then we'll look at the difference between nominal and real GDP, which is calculated with the GDP chain price index. I would like to skip ahead. I'm going to skip ahead to this slide where it looks at those four things. So GDP measures, consumption plus investment plus government consumption and investment plus net exports. The other metric we want to look at is national income, which is essentially just gross domestic product minus depreciation. Gross domestic product minus the cost of producing that in a given time period. So if American companies produce $16.8 trillion worth of GDP, but the erosion of the factories, their farms, the materials that are used in that are significant, then that's important to an economy's ability to continue to produce at that level. So national income is GDP minus depreciation. Then we get to personal income. So GDP, if you may have noticed, it's the amount of money going to the producers of the resource, the factory owners, the corporations. Like they're the ones who sell everything. Of course, if you're an entrepreneur, you're included in GDP. But the resource owners are the one who benefit or directly get the money for GDP. And then national income is just essentially how much those people got paid. In order to look at how much the consumers, how much the citizens got paid, we get to a personal income metric, which is of course important. And we calculate that by taking the national income and we subtract off the corporate profits. So corporations take their profits. What's left over are the money that goes to the people who are providing those goods, providing those services. And what we add to national income are transfer payments. So citizens, they reap the benefits of the GDP minus depreciation, minus corporate profits, plus any transfer payments that come from the government. Let's actually look at that one. Yeah, let's look at this one. This is national income. So our national income,
Or no, this is personal income. So, I want to do this. I want to back up a minute. That's what I want to do. I want to start from the beginning now that I've given you an overview of the first three. Let's do it this way. So, national income, of course, is GDP minus depreciation. And this is the salary paid to the resource owners. So GDP was 16.8 in 2013, minus depreciation of $2.3 trillion. That seems like a lot, right? 15% depreciation. Question?
Yeah, I'm not sure where depreciation is coming from. How,
Yeah, so the erosion of the factories, the companies who produced this, the investments in their tractors, the investment in their assembly line. So that's a measure of the economy's ability to keep producing that level of GDP.
so the only way they can get that is going to income statements and finding depreciation, right? And adding that all up. Is that it?
Right, let's
Is it-
how they do
I
it.
think it's determined by, wasn't it determined by the government? Appreciation for each, like, when you have a brand new car and you want to buy it, and then when you drive it off, it's worth less.
Yeah.
That's an example.
Yeah, so there's accounting
I
depreciation.
know that. I know that depreciation is, but I've never really heard it used in the GDP context. And I was wondering what they're depreciating. Depreciating airplanes, missiles. No.
Well, so it would be that's a good question. So I guess there's accounting depreciation, and that doesn't necessarily quantify real depreciation. So I honestly don't know how they calculate depreciation, but I do know that it's important for us because if an economy produced a whole lot of GDP, but they also had a whole lot of depreciation, then we have questions about whether or not that country can maintain that level of GDP. So
Can depreciation change?
yeah, so I guess if we consider GDP, high GDP a good thing, then we would consider high depreciation a suspicious, dangerous signal. Alright, so where are we? National income is our GDP minus depreciation, however it's calculated. Exactly, we're not sure. And now we're moving on to personal income, which is how much money is going into the pockets of the consumers. So GDP minus depreciation gives us national income. And then we subtract off corporate profits, and then we add in transfer payments. So of the 14.5 trillion of national income, 2.1 trillion was corporate profits. And transfer payments in 2013 amounted to $2.8 trillion. So a significant part. Big part of, I guess, personal income. So what's 2.8 divided by 14? That's like 18%? Something like that? So government transfer payments are 18% of personal income. So these government payments can be a huge factor in spurring economic growth. And then lastly, we have disposable income, which is personal income minus taxes. Okay, moving ahead, personal income in 2013 was 14.1 minus personal tax. Yeah, 14.1 minus 1.6 in personal taxes, and left disposable income 12.5 trillion for consumers to spend, put more into the economy, to make sure we don't go into another recession. Question?
When I was in the book, they talk about later on depreciation of currency. So that might be the depreciation we're talking about in GDP.
In this chapter, depreciation of
Not
currency?
in this chapter, later on in the book. We talk about depreciation of currency.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot more sense if that's what they're
So power of the dollar.
referring to.
Yeah, I don't think so for GDP. Not depreciation of currency. Depreciation of currency is important as we think about the value of what we can buy in foreign markets, or what foreigners can buy in our markets. But depreciation is just depreciation of our ability to produce that level of GDP. For GDP, I would think of it that way. So, how much have we compromised our ability to keep producing that level of output? All right. So I think I skipped around a little bit with all those, but we have them all, right? GDP, national income, personal income, and disposable income. Yeah.
What's an example of government transfer payment?
Social Security check, welfare check, unemployment. Yes.
So the transfer payments, don't they also talk about, for instance, workers in the U.S. who would be sending money to other countries? These would be transfer payments.
What would that be figured in? Would that be figured into GDP?
Yeah, and actually it might be in the export imports, because basically, there's a lot of, and they do characterize them as transfer payments.
Okay, so remember, GDP does not include transfer payments. GDP does not factor transfer payments. GDP is just the expenditures on final goods and services. Question, Lonnie?
No, I just think there is a lot of money that they probably do spend on
The government spends on
welfare and social security.
yeah, it was 2.8 trillion. Yeah, 2.8 trillion in
That's what we're
2013.
talking about. Okay, now I get it.
Okay, so but where I guess transfer payments would be a huge factor if we're sending money to foreign markets would come into personal income and disposable income. So if we have a huge GDP, but a big chunk of our workers are sending their money to different markets, then the citizens of that market are going to have less money to keep spurring that economy. So that is a very important point, Dr. Williams. All right. And any other questions on that before we move on? All right. So I'm going to make the distinction now between nominal GDP and real GDP. It's important we know the difference. What is nominal GDP and what is real GDP? Nominal in name.
Numbers.
Yeah, it is the actual number. So 2013, 16.8 trillion. That is the number, the name of GDP. And what is real GDP?
Actual.
Okay. Actual? Okay, what do you mean by actual?
Current, maybe?
Current? All right. Well, inflation is going to factor prominently into the difference. Does that help anyone? So the difference between nominal and real has to do with inflation.
Kind of like counting profit. Like, so the number, and then it's probably the number minus the inflation.
Yeah. So real GDP is nominal GDP adjusted for inflation. So if we were to say our GDP in 1960 was $4 trillion, so let everyone keep writing for a minute. When I see everyone writing, I know that's a sign I should stop talking for at least a minute. So if we were to say our GDP in 1960 was $4 trillion, and our GDP in 2013 is now $16 trillion, wow, it grew by 4 times, 400%. Would that be completely accurate? No, it wouldn't, because prices doubled, or maybe even tripled, since 1960. So our real GDP, the benefit, the welfare, the economic virtue we were able to grab from that production may have increased, but it didn't increase 4 times. We have to adjust for inflation. And so that's why real GDP is an important calculation for us. All right, so real GDP, nominal is all the actual number of all goods produced in that time period. Real GDP, the final
goods produced during a given time period based on prices in a select base year. So what that means is we'll take one base year and say, this is how much, we're going to use as our base year. This is how much you would have paid for a basket of goods in, say, 2009. It cost $100 for this group of stuff. In 2010, it cost $102 for that. In 2011, it cost $104.7. And if we go back to, say, 1991, it cost $87. And back to 1940, it cost only $20 for that same basket of goods. We'll just have one base year, and we will scale everything from there. Let me skip ahead to the actual calculation for what we call the chain price index, which allows us to adjust everything for inflation. We take the nominal GDP and we divide by what we'll call the chain price index, which is sort of how much did that basket of goods cost. In 2009, it cost $100. In 2010, it cost $102. So we divide this by a bigger number. In 2012, it cost $106, so now we divide this by an even bigger number. And then, of course, we go back to 1997, it cost $91. So we're dividing this by a smaller number, which means the nominal GDP will be bigger. Or excuse me, we'll divide the nominal GDP by a smaller number, which means the real GDP would be bigger, relative. And then we multiply by 100 just to get it in standardized terms. I don't think I make you do any calculations on the quiz. I just want you to understand that real GDP is some variation of nominal GDP based on inflation.
So the chain price index is how much the price went up or down during the time.
Yeah, let's look at it. There's a little graph. So if we're using 2009 as the base year, we might measure some basket of goods, typical things, a gallon of gasoline, a gallon of milk, various things that measure an economy. And we'd say this cost $100 in 2009. What does it cost in 2013? $107. So for 2013, we take the nominal GDP divided by 107 times 100 just to get that back in standardized terms. And that will give us our real GDP. So dividing by 107 is going to make this a little bit smaller. Fair enough? But what if we divide this instead? What if we're looking at 2000, where that same basket of goods almost only cost $81.9? So for 2000, we take the nominal GDP in 2000, we divide by 81, so that number less than 100 is going to make this bigger. So we're going to make the real GDP back in 2000 bigger than the nominal GDP. All right. So I don't see any angry faces, but I don't see any enthusiastic I get it. So this is nothing really complicated, just as long as you understand.
The GDP chain price is something that, chain price index that they determine every year. This is the number for this country.
Yes, for that year. And they would look at it like a basket of goods.
Okay.
So if the basket of same goods that we bought last year cost $102, then we've had a 2% inflation rate over the last year. All right. Where does that leave us? So let's take a look at how real GDP and nominal GDP has grown. So this with 2009 being the base year, that just happens to be where real GDP and nominal GDP are the same. We could have picked any year for the base year. The important thing to note is just look at the trend. Look at the trend for nominal GDP and look at the trend for real GDP. So if we could see from 1980 to 2000, it looks like a really sharp increase in nominal GDP. So everyone's saying, wow, the economy is growing gangbusters. But we see a slower increase in real GDP because we had significant inflation during that time period. Right. So good. I think we've got through the basics of GDP. We know how it's adjusted for inflation. And I think we're ready to move on. Business cycles and unemployment. So let's look at how business cycles are measured, what causes business cycles, and how employment factors into that. Our economic growth is just a change in GDP. If we have more GDP, we call that economic growth. If we have less GDP, we call that economic contraction. And what causes changes in economic growth or contraction, we can break that down into our components of GDP. So if consumer spending goes up, this whole thing is going to go up, and it could equate to economic growth. Investment by companies go up, then that could spur economic growth as well. Government spending, governments could spend more, that could start a positive, virtuous economic cycle. If we manage to, say, export a lot and get Americans or get whatever country we're working in, get the folks in the home country to buy fewer imports and more home country goods, that could spur economic growth as well. All right, so we don't always have economic growth, unfortunately. Tragically, we wish to just grow and grow and grow. We have business cycles, ups and downs in the periods of economic growth. 4 phases which we'll talk about: peak, recession, trough, and expansion. So, on this graph, we have real GDP for a year, and we have time period on the horizontal graph. So we see GDP increasing. For whatever reason, folks are spending more, government is investing more, companies are seeing that folks are spending more, so they start producing more, they start investing more, and the GDP reaches a peak. But at some point, for some reason, consumers start spending less, companies start spending less as a result, GDP starts to decrease, and we'll call the lowest point the trough. So we hit the peak, we start to decrease in GDP, we'll call that a recession. The lowest point is the trough, and GDP increases after the lowest point. Whatever reason, whatever events might encourage consumers to spend more, and we call that an expansion. Economists, government officials will all think about what can we do to create an expansion? What can we do to get this economy going? Well, I know this is simplified, but why not? Why not for our discussion just say, here's what we can do to get the economy going? There is validity in making our argument just that simple. What can we do to get consumers to spend more? What can we do to encourage companies to invest more? Can we give them tax incentives? Can we decrease their taxes? There's a huge discussion about this every political cycle. It sometimes is phrased as a rich people versus poor people type of discussion, but there's certainly a consideration. What might we be able to do to get companies to invest more and use the resources and build the GDP of an economy? And of course, government expenditures is a key role. How much is the government spending? How could that increase? And of course, exports, imports. We've heard that a lot this election cycle. I'm sure it would be no different as we move forward. All right, so let's just talk through the definitions of each of these. I've already given you the overview, so just means of reviewing. Peak, phase of the business cycle during which the GDP reaches a maximum. Recession, economy goes down. And during which real GDP declines, unemployment rates rise. We could also call this a contraction. You may have heard contraction rather than recession. Generally, as a rule, 2 consecutive quarters in which the GDP declines is called a recession. 2 quarters of negative growth in GDP, economists will say recession. The term depression, I wanted to put this slide in or keep this slide in because that's not really a term that economists use for anything besides the extremely long recession in the 1930s. And even in 2007 to 2009, there was some discussion, is this going to be another depression? Well, we ended up just calling that the Great Recession, and we reserved the term depression for one particular historical event. And of course, we talked about the trough, the lowest point in the business cycle. And recovery, this could be called recovery or expansion. When the economy is increasing, we could call that expansion, we could call that a recovery. Don't get confused when you hear those terms interchanged. So let's take a look at some of our actual business cycles. What's going on in this graph? Let me get you all involved a little bit more, and we'll think about what might have been happening in the economy and each of these points, and how we can put that in the context of our framework for economic growth and expansion. So, what's going on here in 2001? Can anybody walk me through that?
GDP fell 2 quarters.
Yeah,
Went into recession.
GDP fell significantly. What did we have? What was going on in 2001? There were a couple. What's that? Yeah, there was September 11th. The economy was going down before then, as I recall.
.com.
We had the internet bubble. Yeah, we had a lot of excitement, a lot of growth. The internet, sell everything on the internet, do everything on the internet, and we had a correction. I guess sometimes financiers will call it that. A correction on just how realistic we were about our assumptions there. And September 11th, of course, happened, and a variety of things contributed to that recession. But the economy continued a trend overall of going up. Now, the economy will generally trend up in real terms if for no other reason than that the population is increasing. So we have more people, more workers to produce more. And at the same time, technology is increasing, so we're able to produce more with less. So real GDP will typically increase. And then, of course, the Great Recession of 2000, we had a decrease which lasted longer than we wanted to, longer than we would like. Okay, so got some historical recessions of past times. Of course, the recession 2007 to 2009, economists said it lasted 18 months. We had a real GDP decrease, 4.1%. And the peak unemployment rate got all the way up to 9.7. Scary times. What else? Can I get some other folks to tell me your recollection of any of these others? 91, 1980, post-World War II.
91 was that because of the war, Desert Storm?
I don't know if it was. There was definitely a factor because the oil,
Yeah.
all right, the potential shortage of oil scared the markets. Not only just the idea of it, but in reality. And 91, I don't know if you heard Donald Trump explain what a tough time 91 was recently. Did everyone hear that, he had that tax return leak where he had this huge $1 billion loss in, I think, what was it, 95? Somewhere around there. And he talked about, well, the recession around this time was, something we had never really seen before. Where there were other times recently that we had similar types of recession, but it had its effect there for sure. In 1980, 81, 82.
73 to 75, they had the oil embargo. Gas lines, able to buy gas every other day, when your license plate was odd or even.
That's right. I heard the lines were unbelievable.
Lines were
Yeah.
blocks long, yeah.
You have to get up like really early.
Yeah.
Like 2 hours early just to get to work.
Yeah. So tell us more about that. What were the politics involved, and how did that affect the economy?
I think it's when OPEC really flexed its muscle and tried to really control the market. And so they were limiting, if I remember correctly, the oil. Anyway, there was a kind of oil embargo, and so that had a tremendous impact on the United States, because we were almost totally dependent. Now, we're not quite as dependent now on Saudi Arabia and the cartels oil, but we were at that time. And then there was a repeat a few years later. The lines weren't quite as bad as they were in 73 to 75.
OPEC tried it again in 1980? Okay.
Around that area,
Yeah. All right. And we had some tough economic times faced by Jimmy Carter. And, yeah. All right. Good. Good discussion.
Well, let me ask you a question,
Yes.
Professor Williams. Where do you think we are now in terms of cycle?
That's
What cycle are we in now?
Cycle we in now.
Recovery,
I don't know. Lonnie, help me out. Where are we?
recovery, it's the same thing, right?
Yeah, recovery, expansion, considered the same thing. So the recession, the Great Recession, I think economists say is definitely over, and we're not going in a downturn again. Are we going to keep seeing modest growth? Are we going to reach another peak? I don't know for sure. Hopefully we're going to continue to go up. We haven't reached the peak. Hope we're not on the way, ready to start going down.
Well, we have there's some soft underbelly out there. I mean, for instance, the mortgage crisis really hit in 2009, because or 2007, because people were buying houses and being approved houses, so they shouldn't have been approved for that credit. Today, it's different. What the real soft underbelly is cars, because you look at how much money is out there right now. These car companies are reselling these cars. Rates, I know one person's paying 24% interest rate on a car, but that's really kind of across the country. And that was in a meeting recently. People were saying this is the major thing that a lot of the investment companies are really concerned about, is the impact of defaults, when people just can't make the payments on these new cars, or even used cars for that matter.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so these new car sales are driving GDP, just like new home sales were increased prior to the Great Recession. So these terms that people are buying them at, we are potentially setting ourselves up for another recession.
Well,
Hopefully not.
unless
And a lot of
someone gets control of it.
and a lot of heartbreak.
Great
Well,
car crash.
More importantly,
What's that?
Great
student
car
debt.
crash.
They say student debt is going to be a huge impact soon.
Yeah,
Credit cards,
yeah,
but student debt definitely is going to have.
yeah,
Someone's going to have to look into that. soon.
yeah.
Yeah, student debt, that's right.
Because it's that, and you try to go. A lot of students go out with jobs they can't, so they owe
Mm-hmm.
the money for school, and they don't have jobs. So I think it's double impact on the GDP.
Yeah, well, they could default on the debt, and that could hurt lending, which could really tighten up the economy. And that was the thing that stalled the economy the fastest in 2007. It wasn't that there was a real threat of companies not being able to produce, is that nobody was lending any money whatsoever because everyone was terrified. So if banks are not lending money, then businesses cannot expand. Businesses who are on the edge could potentially go out of business if they can't get a quick loan, and that has a domino effect. So it could have the same effect, the student loans, student debt crisis, all the children of the Great Recession, as Hillary Clinton called them, who are living at home in their parents' basements, and they can't get jobs, and they have $60,000 in debt. It could be a real problem. All right. So, all right, let me see. What do I want to do here? You want to take a break? You want to keep going for a little bit? It's up to you. Yeah. All right. Let's get to economic indicators, and after we do that, we will take a break. So, first, let's look at international comparison of GDP growth rates. All right, which economies are growing the fastest? So China is killing it, literally, some might say, with pollution, but GDP is expanding like crazy. India, GDP is growing considerably. United States is putting up a modest growth rate. And United Kingdom, also modest growth rate. We'll see what happens with this Brexit thing, if that tanks their economy. Hopefully not. All right, so we've got some growth rates of GDP. Now, we want our GDP to always be growing. We would love it. And we have some things that we look out for called indicators, which give us an idea of whether or not GDP is going to grow, whether or not it's going to decrease. And we break those into three different categories: leading indicators, coincident indicators, and lagging indicators. Can anyone tell me what leading indicators are? So these are indicators that flash a red light, essentially, about where the economy is going to go in the future. So if we have a lot of factory orders, if we have a lot of personal income or unemployment claims, or fewer job seekers, we'll talk about what they are, but they are just things that we can look at, which will give us an idea about whether or not a recession or an expansion is coming in the next 6 months, 6 to 12 months perhaps. Coincident economic indicators are the same type of things, the same type of metrics, which happen during either a recession or an expansion. So when we're in a recession, there are certain things that we can look at to tell us that yes, we are in a recession, because we had a certain number of factory orders for durable goods, we had a certain number of unemployment claims, we had a certain number of bank defaults, we had a certain number of increased loans. And then lastly, we'll look at lagging economic indicators, which are just important to monitor, just to give economists a better understanding of how the economy is functioning. Lagging economic indicators will happen after the expansion or recession has taken place. So after the recession has taken place, 6 to 12 months later, we will see various things where economists will look at this is the aftermath of a recession. This makes sense. Or this is the aftermath of an expansion. This makes sense. So what I'd like to do is look at these three. I'm going to give you one example of each, and then I want you all to think of some examples for me, and then we'll have a discussion about that. So I'll do that in this order. So our leading indicator, variables that change before real GDP. Let me look at an example. So the one I'm going to take is unemployment claims. So if we have an increase in unemployment claims, economists would say, whoa, there's an increase in unemployment claims. That means companies are laying off people because they're not getting as many orders for their goods. So that might mean we're headed for a recession 6 to 12 months from now. Even though things are good now, because we have unemployment claims, that does not bode well for the future. So we would call that a leading economic indicator. All right, let me do the same thing with coincident and lagging, and then we'll get the discussion going. Coincident variables that change at the same time, real GDP changes. Coincident indicators, industrial production. So this would be how much companies are actually producing. So during an expansion, companies are actually producing a lot because customers are buying a lot. During an actual contraction, during an actual recession, companies are not producing as much because customers aren't able to buy as much. So this is something economists look at and say industrial production is down. Yes, we are right smack in the middle of a recession. And then as I mentioned, lagging, variables that change after real GDP changes. An example might be, what do I want to do? Duration of unemployment, consumer pricing, commercial and industrial loans. Okay, so let me take commercial and industrial loans. So there's a couple ways you could interpret this. Loans might have a long duration. They might have a duration of a year or 5 years. So as an economy is going through contraction, as an economy is going through recession, bankers are going to be less likely to loan to companies because these companies are going to face a tough economic environment and are not going to be able to pay that back. But with a longer duration of commercial and industrial loans, it's going to take a while before the bankers really say, all right, no more loans because all these loans that were scary are maturing and turning over. So after the recession is over, the banking industry just might be reeling from this recession and not be in a position or not want to loan or not want to renew loans. Make sense? All right. Now, what I wanted to do is just have you all talk a little bit about some of these indicators. And economics is a social science. It's not a natural science. So it's not exact in that sense. So some of these could be interpreted either way, but I want you to go through a thought process of thinking about what would make them true. Why are certain indicators leading, coincident, or lagging? So why don't we do this? How about each of you could pick two, like one leading, one lagging, or whatever you want to choose. You could choose two coincident, you could choose two lagging, and again, think about why that is correctly placed under leading or lagging. Because I know some of them you could say, well, that doesn't really belong there, but let's think about how economists might think about those things. So take just a couple minutes and we'll think about, and we'll have that discussion. Okay. So does everyone have their 2? No? Yes? All right. Who's got one of the leading indicators? And there are 2. Yes, Andres, what do you got?
That's, I guess, stock prices.
Okay, tell us about that.
Pretty much increase or decrease would cause a swing in the economy.
Oh, okay.
Being a leading, I would agree that it's a leading indicator.
Okay, so I like where you're going with this. Now, we're looking at this as an indicator. So when we look at the stock price go up, we think, ooh, expansion. When we look at the stock price go down, we think, ooh, maybe we're headed for a recession. So it's something that gives us an early warning sign. So how would the stock prices be an early warning sign? I feel like the way you framed that was that it would be a cause of a recession or expansion. It would not necessarily be a cause, it would be an indication. So tell me why we would be able to use that as an indication.
Again, I guess because of the swings in the economy based off the market expectations or the way it performed.
All right. So let me lay this out. Tell me if you agree. The answer I'm looking for here is that investors are tuned in to what's happening in the economy, and if they're spending their own money and they're investing, they know whether or not we're going for a recession or expansion. And if they're buying more stocks and stock prices are going up, then that's the smart money is saying we're headed for an expansion. Does that make sense?
Okay.
The people who have the money to invest, who are in the know about what's happening in this economy, when they put more money in the stock market and stock prices go up, that's an indicator. They say the smart money is pointing towards expansion. Or if stock prices are going down, they'll say the smart money is pointing towards recession. Have you heard that term before, the smart money? All right, the investors who are in the know. All right, good. Anyone have, who else has a leading indicator? Dave?
And new building permits.
Okay, tell us about it.
So the investors are investing, putting an upfront cost in capital with the expectation that they're going to earn that investment back.
Yeah. So we have more investors who are moving into more buildings. So if the companies are moving into more buildings, that means they're ready to produce more, possibly because they have more orders coming for things they need to produce. Ergo, we're headed towards a expansion. Great. All right. Who else has a leading indicator? Lon.
It shows delayed deliveries, but I thought about it in both ways.
Yes, you definitely can think about it both ways.
So
I did.
delayed deliveries, maybe they can't keep up with all the orders because they're doing so well that they can't get it yet.
That's it. That sounds good to me. We have delayed deliveries. You think of that maybe as a bad thing, but economists say, look at all these companies who are backed up. They got people clamoring for their products. That means we are headed for an expansion. Luke.
So like if you're looking at a leading factor, I looked at average work week. So as you have a longer work week, say your labor cost goes up because you have to pay those workers, or if it decreases, I kind of looked at it as like lagging with leading.
Okay. All right. So
and then as it goes down,
well, tell me
your
what
labor cost decreases.
So if if the average work week goes up, does that mean we're headed for a recession or expansion?
Well, not necessarily. I'd say it's growing.
So, all right, so these are something which will tell us whether or not we're headed for expansion or recession.
Right.
And we want to think about how. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me, what do you think? So if you tell me, if I tell you, average work week has increased. Last month it was 39 hours. This week it's 42 hours. What are you as the economist going to say?
Workers are getting paid more.
Yes, but are we headed for a recession or expansion?
Expansion? No.
I think expansion. So that means companies
More output.
companies see fit to approve overtime, hire more people to work longer. Less their salary. Okay,
They
you
don't
could
hire enough people.
absolutely.
That's what
I don't know about that.
Absolutely. You could look at it that way. So they have to fire a bunch of hourly employees, and then their salary workers are working longer. You could look at that way. Okay, should we move on to coincident? All right, who's got some coincident indicators for us? No one?
The manufacturing and the trade sale, it's like the manufacturing make the price going up and the everything product is going up and when they sell it, the price will go up. So it's the same time.
Okay, so I feel like this one similar to industrial production. So the more companies and suppliers are selling to each other. They're the producers of these goods, and if they have more orders, they're going to be doing more manufacturing and trade sales, more raw material sales. Yeah, perfect. Anyone else? Personal income goes up. All right, this happens in the middle of an expansion or recession because companies are working more. They're able to pay their workers more. Average work weeks have already gone up. Anyone have a lagging indicator for us? Good. Dr. Webb?
Well, it's interesting. You take unemployment rate it's going up, I guess, as a lagging indicator. But you know, there seems to be a conflict between you can have unemployment claims can be a leading indicator, but unemployment rate is a lagging indicator, and that's slicing the onion pretty thin there, actually, because they see are really kind of flip sides of each other. And so I have a little trouble as to how one can be a leading indicator and the other can be a lagging indicator.
All right, so you want to think it through, or you want somebody to help you?
Well, my thinking through would be the claims is when you have absolute claim on the money, and so the money supply is affected. Might be reason why they would talk it's a leading indicator, whereas the unemployment rate, you don't really get that till after you've gone through a period of time and to see that your rate has flipped down. So that may be the fact that it
Claims
Is
is
this okay? I don't know. I could interpret this two ways. The unemployment claims would be initial claims, like initial claims of unemployment. Could they also be talking about unemployment insurance, which only lasts? I mean, it lasts a while. It lasts like 52 weeks, right? Unemployment insurance, but that could be the initial part, like the initial claim or the initial period where you get unemployment
Well, I
insurance.
think they may do this weekly. Actually, I think this information is reported weekly across the country as to what the claims are. The rate, however, is kind of a more aggregate understanding what the rate is that comes in at a later period of
or
time.
people that might not be working but can't collect unemployment anymore.
We're still,
Maybe not even on unemployment benefits,
okay.
Or people that are not seeking work.
just not working.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll talk about that after the break. Discouraged workers. Okay, great. Other lagging indicators?
Credit to income ratio.
Okay, good.
After the recession, they may have used up all their credit and not
Wait, which one are you? Credit to lagging indicators?
commercial credit.
Oh, commercial credit to personal income ratio. Okay, got it.
Is commercial credit the same as like your own credit?
So this is like a business that has credit. So your business has a line of credit, so if you need to pay your supplier.
All of that, because you weren't making any money during the recession.
All right, so this is
the
the
commercial goes back to your point earlier. That the banks are just not loaning money, and so that really has an impact on business development in a very significant way.
Alright, so commercial credit, this is going to be challenging without coffee, but alright, let's try to think about it. So commercial credit to personal income ratio. So if the amount of credit that businesses are, extended to businesses, like if you have a business and you get a line of credit, if you have a whole factory, you get a line of credit. If that's really high, and then personal income is really low. Alright, so this might be really high. What happens if that changes? If all of a sudden you don't get your line of credit and the personal income increases?
Can't do it. Oh,
Yeah, what does it mean? This goes from high if this is what does it mean if this is high? Alright, this is on
that's if you have a high personal credit to, debt to income ratio, you can't buy a condo.
What
Like
is
that's
it?
one of the things that they look at.
But it's
income
commercial
debt,
credit.
but commercial is different than
Yeah, but it's commercial. Yeah. So debt to income rate. This is
Debt to
different than
income
that ratio. This is commercial credit to personal income ratio
in the whole
in the whole economy.
everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're not going to loan money to people as quickly as you're going to loan money to business
Can't pay.
because they just don't have the collateral that they can put up. And it's all tied to interest rates anyway. And the problem is the government monetary policy controls interest rates. Like right now, we're keeping the interest rates low, so people will in fact loan more money and spend more money to pump up the economy. But that's an artificial element that's coming in there.
Okay. So while we're on interest rates, tell us how prime interest rate is a lagging indicator.
Well, I guess it's a lagging indicator because you really don't have an assessment of what's happening. I mean, for instance, they're trying to keep the interest rates low right now, but you don't know the impact that that's going to have.
So they're
on
keeping the
business
interest
well
rates
after.
low. Okay, they're keeping the interest rates low now. So what happened in the recent past, which would make them keep the interest rates low?
Well, there's got to be monetary policy to change the interest rates, either raise the interest rates or lower the interest rates. But the thing is, you don't know what the impact's going to be till after a significant period of time.
Okay, so we're talking about lagging indicators. So the interest rates are low now because they are lagging behind something that recently happened. And economists are going to look at that and say, interest rates are low now. What happened in the recent past, which would keep interest rates low? We're going through a recovery. We just got out of a recession, right? So monetary policy wants to keep the interest rates low so we don't go back into a recession, right? So
Now,
so the
But
interest
you don't
rates
know
are
the impact of that till much later. I mean, you can set the interest rates, but you don't really have an idea what that impact's going to be till subsequent period of time.
excellent point. So we're going to find out later if that works, if that's a good strategy, keeping the interest rates low post recession. But for right now, we're just talking about how that's a lagging indicator. And if we have a period of expansion, what do you think might happen to interest rates in that case?
Well, if they're concerned about inflation, they would raise the interest rates.
After a period of expansion, we would raise the interest rates. And if that went over your head, we're going to talk about that in a few sessions. How low interest rates will spur more business loans and get the economy going, and high interest rates will decrease loans and combat inflation. But I think we've got it in terms of how that could be a lagging indicator after the recession or expansion has occurred. All right, let's take 10, and we'll come back and we'll knock out unemployment. All right, let's get started. Let's talk about unemployment and how we measure unemployment and how that fits into our discussion of business cycle related to GDP growth and GDP negative growth. So, some terms and definition before we can have a real discussion. Unemployment rate, percentage of people in the civilian labor force who are without jobs and are actively seeking jobs. How do we determine civilian labor force? How do we determine actively seeking jobs? How do we determine without jobs? So let's make sure we're clear on those things. All right, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a survey every month. That's how they get it. We consider the civilian workforce to be people 16 years or older who are either employed or actively seeking a job excluding members of the armed forces, homemakers, and people in institutions. So 16 years or older, actively seeking. Total population 16 and over. We've got these institutionalized persons, armed forces, people who are household workers, students, retirees, not in the labor force. In the civilian labor force, we have people who are either employed or self-employed, and we have various people who are unemployed for whatever reason. And we take this unemployed persons divided by the total civilian labor force to get our unemployment rate. Let me skip ahead actually to that. I think that came out blurry on your slide. This unemployment rate, unemployed divided by civilian labor force.
It's not people on unemployment.
Right. Well, first of all, because unemployment runs out, right? Runs out after 52 weeks. All right, let me make sure I've got all these terms for you. Who's considered employed? I'm going back a little bit, sorry. Anyone who works at least 1 hour a week for pay or at least 15 hours per week as an unpaid worker. So 1 hour a week. That sounds a little light, right? If you work just 1 hour a week, you're considered employed. I don't know who made that rule up. Probably something political. Let's say people are employed if they work 4 hours a month. Making any money at all? Well,
Nothing.
yes. All right. And of course, anyone who is 16 years of age and is actively seeking employment, but is not employed, is considered unemployed. All right, discouraged worker. This is going to be a key term for us as we discuss the validity of the unemployment statistics. A discouraged worker is a person who wants work but has given up searching for work. So, what do you think? Should we count that person in the unemployment figures? They want work, they really would love a job, but they've given up searching for whatever reason.
Don't count.
Don't count them? You say don't count them? Don't count them? Why not?
Because they're lazy.
They're lazy. They're still part of. They're still voters, right? They're still part of our workforce. They're still people who have skills. Aren't anyone want to make a vote for counting them in the?
They could at least pretend they're looking.
Well, they do want to work.
Yeah.
They just haven't been able to find a job that fits their skill set.
Yeah. So they moved back in with their parents, or they said, "Fine, I'm going to go down to wherever and live on modest retirement savings I have."
Or if someone is employed, if they work for an hour making anything, that person can do that.
Yeah, but why would they do that? Just to skew the numbers? Just to say that they're employed? They're not going to say, I'm going to work for an hour a week just so when the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls me, I'll be able to say that I'm employed. They don't care about what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says. So these folks are not counted in the unemployment rate. So that makes the unemployment rate lower. And some people would say artificially lower. They would say the unemployment rate is 7%. But if you count all the discouraged workers, it would be 11%.
They ask you that question when you're on unemployment, you have to prove that you're looking. You're still looking for a job.
Yeah, so that's, I wonder how that fits into the calculation. I feel like it's mostly a political calculation of why they don't count them on the unemployment rate. There's, what you're referring to is motivation. They want people to actually be motivated before they get government assistance. But just in terms of counting them or not counting them, that's what we'll look at first. All right, what do we have? We have 16 and over, we have 245 million people in the United States, minus 90 million people not in the workforce, which leaves a civilian workforce of 155 million. We have 11.5 million unemployed people, not in counting discouraged workers. So that gives us our civilian unemployment rate of 7.4%.
percentage is that are discouraged workers?
I'm sure they do. They must.
Doesn't come in.
They must. So they'll call your house. They'll say, "Are you working?" You'll say no. Say, "Are you looking for a job?" You'll say no. They're like, "You're not." And they're not calling to check on you for employment. They're just calling for the poll statistically to find out what the unemployment rate is. They must. They must. I don't know how they do that though. All right. So let's look at a graph trend through time. Unemployment rate on the vertical axis, 1930 all the way up to 2010 or 2013 on the horizontal axis. Great Depression, unemployment rate up to close to 25%. Not in counting the people who got discouraged and stopped looking for work. What else happened here? The 1980s, we had that recession spike. 1991, when Donald Trump lost all of that money, we had a little spike. I guess we had a little 2001. I guess we had a little. I don't know. I guess we didn't have too bad of a spike in 2001, even though we had a decrease in GDP. We had a very modest spike, I think, in the unemployment rate. It seems, and then of course 2007, 2009. Whoa, we've got a fairly low, less than 4% unemployment rate before the Great Recession, and then went all the way up to 9% in the depths of the recession. So, U.S. unemployment rate graph over time. Unemployment rates for selected nations. We've got unemployment on the vertical axis, different nations on the horizontal axis. Greece, my God, has anyone been following what's been happening with Greece? And the economy and debt crisis there. So huge unemployment rate in Greece. South Africa, I haven't heard too much in the news about South Africa. I didn't know they're unemployed. I was surprised to see that when I read that in the textbook, that the unemployment rate is so high there. Japan traditionally has a very low unemployment rate. Alright, so some statistics about other countries and employment rates. Criticisms. Alright, how does unemployment not really reflect the true nature of what's going on in the economy? Well, one thing we talked about it does not include discouraged workers. So if it did include discouraged workers, it would be higher. So you just need to know that when you hear unemployment rate. Well, that could be higher. You'll hear a lot of people talk about that when they're doing economic forecasts. They'll say this does not include a huge number of discouraged workers. And the number of discouraged workers is higher than usual.
Well, what about housewives? Like if people say I'm housewife.
So you're not unemployed. You're not in the.
So in the Depression, there were a lot more people because women didn't really work.
Yeah. So let's see. That they're not even considered, I guess, in the civilian. Household workers are not in the labor force. Yeah. So we have 25% people looking for work and not able to find it. And then we have another 50% of the people not looking for work. And then we have, I don't know, 25% of the people actually have a job. All right. Also includes part-time workers. We talked about that. We laughed a little bit about it. If you're just working 1 hour a week, then somebody at the Bureau of Labor Statistics is able to say that you are employed. And it does not measure underemployment. So perhaps if you're a financier during the Great Recession and you lose your job and you're working less than you would like to be working, you're working in a job that you're way overqualified for, it doesn't measure the impact of that on your negative quality of life and also your potential to create more economic growth if you're in a job that you have the skills for. So, doesn't include that. We just need to be cognizant of that. Underemployment, people working at jobs below their level of skills. Types of unemployment. Frictional.
Structural, cyclical. Have any of you heard of these three before? No? All right, first time. I'll explain them. Frictional. All right, this is unemployment between jobs. Suppose you get laid off and you're going to keep the job, you're going to stay in the same industry, and you're just looking for a job in that same industry. And the reason why you don't have a job at this exact moment is you're in the process of applying. You're not trying to develop other skill sets. You're just trying to get a job in the same industry. And it's understandable. There'll be some frictional unemployment. Structural. All right, this is a mismatch in skill sets. So you have skills of being a financier, and there are no jobs in finance. So, all right, you got to go back to school. You got to be underemployed. You got to wait for the economy to turn around and hope that you can get a job as soon as there's some economic growth. Cyclical. This has to do with cycles in the economy. So you're unemployed because we're in a recession, because the company that you worked for is not getting as many orders, so they laid off workers. It's just because the economy is down. It's not because you lack the skills to work in that industry, and it's not a frictional unemployment, which is very temporary. It's cyclical. So let me click through each of those, make sure I explain that thoroughly. Frictional, normal search time required by workers with no marketable skills, who are changing jobs, entering or re-entering the labor force, or seasonally unemployed. Structural, a mismatch of skills of workers out of work and the skills required for existing job opportunities. Mismatch of skills. Let me come back to this. Cyclical. Unemployment caused by lack of jobs during a recession. Any questions on any of that? All right. So that's going to bring us to our discussion of full employment and the GDP gap. Okay, full employment is a bit of a misnomer. It doesn't mean that everyone is employed. What it means is that there is no cyclical unemployment. So when the economy is operating at full capacity in the business cycle, that means we have what economists would call full employment. There may be some frictional unemployment, as people are just rearranging, moving, trying to find jobs, getting fired. There may be some structural unemployment, as some of the workforce is retraining for new jobs that are available in this boom economy. But there is no cyclical unemployment. So when the economy operates at an unemployment rate equal to the sum of the frictional and structural unemployment rates, also called the natural employment rate. So this again, like I said, it can be a bit of a misnomer. It doesn't mean everyone has a job, but it just means there is no cyclical unemployment. And that brings us to the GDP gap. All right, this is an interesting just way to summarize what we've learned tonight and go through that thought process. So GDP gap is the difference between actual real and full employment real GDP. So we have the actual real GDP that we earned as a country in 2015. And we have the potential GDP that we could have had if there was full employment. Now, if we're in the middle of a recession, then the potential real GDP is going to be higher. Right? So we're in a recession. We have a variety of structural unemployment. So our actual GDP is low as a result of that. Then we just compare. If we had had full employment, what our potential would have been. So if we are in a recession, this is going to be a negative number. And this is just a good metric to think about how unemployment relates to GDP. And so we can understand if we hear an economist, we hear someone talking about the GDP gap. There's a graph here which gives us an idea of this. So let's look at the red part first. So we have the potential real GDP is this dotted line. And then the actual real GDP is the solid line. So let's look at, say, 2007. We have rather close. Wait a minute. 2007, it looks like the potential and the actual are rather close. But then we get this spread. What's going on there? Recession. Okay, so the politicians are saying, gosh, look at that GDP gap. Look at how much we could have made if we get our ducks in a row, if we increase regulation on the banks, if we do whatever to spur the economy. Look at how much more our economy could have grown. Similarly, now what's going on here with this green part of the graph? We have the actual GDP is higher than the potential GDP. Can someone explain that to me? We're making more money than we should, I guess, yeah. So not only are we at a boom economy, not only we're at zero cyclical unemployment, we're actually we actually have a lower unemployment rate than we ever anticipated. So leading up to 2001, that might be an interesting indication. We were employing more people than we ever thought we would. That might have been related to what happened in 2001 with the correction in internet traffic, internet sales, internet growth, when we realized, wait a minute, we just got in over our heads. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but looking back, it allows us to say, oh, that's what happened. That's a way to explain that. Make sense? GDP gap. Any questions or thoughts on that? Has anyone heard that term before, GDP gap? Do you feel smarter now that you know? GDP gap. And I can talk about GDP gap. All right, fantastic. I don't think I have anything else. We've got the definitions. I went over all this stuff. Actually, let me talk. Oh, you know what? I already told you I was about to let you leave, so I'll let you leave. So we'll talk about outsourcing. And then, have questions afterwards?
Well, it's really interesting. I always thought cyclical unemployment was really seasonal unemployment, but it's not. I just got that wrong in what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so cyclical has to do with the cycles that we talked about tonight. Seasonal unemployment is considered frictional unemployment. Like if you're a ski lift operator and it's summertime, then you are unemployed in a frictional sense. You're not going back to school to learn different skills. You are just unemployed because of the time of year.
But I do see a lot of discussion about cyclical unemployment now, and we're not in a recession.
Okay, well, perhaps we could talk about the GDP gap. Can we do that? Let's do that. So we're not quite in a recession now, but we've heard people talk about cyclical unemployment. How would we relate that to our newfound knowledge of GDP gap? You're getting
Still underproducing? I don't know.
Our potential is much higher than what
Slow GDP growth rate.
Our potential is much higher. So even though we're not in a recession, we are still not at full employment. And I think we're not. Like we traditionally think of full employment at 5%. And again, that doesn't mean everyone has a
That
job.
has changed. That's changed over the years. We in World War II, full employment was 4%. Now that's increasingly going up.
Okay. Okay. So what is it now? Is it still around
I think
5%?
it's around 7
No, the unemployment, the
for the acceptable full employment. Right?
full employment is considered 5%,
Yeah, I
and
think
we're-
maybe a little higher than that.
and we're at 7% now.
I think
All
we're
right.
close to 7%.
Okay, so that means we have 2% cyclical unemployment, right?
Right.
So we have those 2% of people, they could be producing more GDP for us, spurring the economy. We have a GDP gap.
Okay.
All right, good. All right, so I gave you a little extra credit there, bonus. I thought you were going to leave. You got a little bit of knowledge before you left. All right.
Hey.
I'll see you. No extra charge on that.
Extra credit.
I'll see you next week. Take care.